Picture a child carrying stones. Each stone is a responsibility she didn't choose, a pain she absorbed so others wouldn't have to feel it. At first, she can carry 3, then 5, then a dozen. People begin to admire her strength. They place more stones in her arms, saying, "You're so capable. You can handle this." She doesn't realize until she's 40, 50, 60 years old that she's been building her own prison brick by brick, stone by stone, and the door has no lock. It never did. She's been free to put them down this entire time. But Freud understood something that most people never grasp. The body that has never known lightness cannot recognize freedom when it arrives. And this is where we must begin. Not with solutions, not with strategies, but with a truth so uncomfortable that most of us will spend our entire lives running from it. There is no such thing as strength without permission to be weak. This is the lie that has kept millions of women imprisoned in their own competence. Freud's most controversial insight wasn't about sexuality or dreams. It was about the violence we commit against ourselves when we exile our own vulnerability. The strong woman isn't strong. She's fractured, and she's been calling that fracture by the wrong name her entire life. What you're about to learn will feel like betrayal at first, because it requires admitting that everything you've been praised for might be the very thing destroying you from the inside. So let me tell you what this video is really about. If you've been the strong one, the one everyone leans on, the one who holds it together when others fall apart, this is for you. Not because you need to be fixed, but because the paradigm you're operating from is fundamentally flawed. You've been told that your strength is your greatest asset, that your ability to endure, to sacrifice, to keep going no matter what, is noble. But what no one told you is this: uninterrupted strength becomes a cage. The woman who cannot be weak cannot be fully human. And the exhaustion you feel isn't from doing too much, it's from being allowed to be too little. Most self-help will tell you to set boundaries, practice self-care, honor your needs. But this goes deeper. It reveals that your compulsive strength is not a character trait. It's a defense mechanism formed in childhood when your survival depended on being indispensable. Freud called this repetition compulsion. The unconscious drive to recreate painful patterns because they feel like home. You're not choosing strength. You're obeying an outdated survival script written by a child who was terrified of what would happen if she stopped being useful. And here's what makes this different from everything else you've heard. This isn't about adding more tools to your toolkit. It's about understanding that the toolkit itself is the problem. Healing doesn't begin when you get stronger. It begins when you stop believing that strength is what makes you worthy of love. I'm going to walk you through the psychoanalytic truth that most modern psychology has forgotten. Your symptom is your solution. Your exhaustion is not the enemy. It's the only voice loud enough to tell you the truth. And by the end of this, you'll understand that letting go isn't weakness. It's the bravest thing you'll ever do. That the little girl who learned to carry the world doesn't need to be strong anymore. She needs to be held. To understand why the woman who had to be strong alone struggles so deeply, we need to go back, not to advice or strategies, but to the origin. Because this didn't start with her. It started long before. There was once a girl who lived in a house where emotions were treated like weather, unpredictable, dangerous, something to be sheltered from. Her father's rage was a storm. Her mother's sadness was a flood. And so, the girl became a builder. She learned to construct walls, to redirect lightning, to absorb water before it could damage the foundation. She became so skilled at this that by the time she was 12, the family stopped noticing the storms altogether. They only noticed her competence. They would say things like, "Thank God you're so mature for your age. I don't know what we'd do without you." And she felt something when they said that. Not pride, exactly. More like relief. Because if she was needed, she was safe. If she was useful, she wouldn't be abandoned. But here's what Freud understood that no one speaks about. The builder is always inside the building. She cannot leave, because if she does, the storms will return, and everyone will know it was her holding it all together. So she stays, year after year, and the skill that saved her as a child becomes the prison that suffocates her as an adult. But here is where we encounter one of the most cruel ironies of the human mind. Asterisk, she doesn't even know she's doing it. Asterisk. You see, these patterns, they operate in what I call the unconscious, below the surface of awareness. She genuinely believes she is being kind, thoughtful, considerate. She tells herself she stays because she times cares asterisk, because leaving would be times selfish asterisk, because good people don't abandon others, and society, oh, society applauds her for it. They call her loyal, selfless, a woman of virtue. Meanwhile, inside, she is dying. Let me give you another example. A young man, let us call him Thomas, comes to me paralyzed by indecision. He cannot choose a career, cannot commit to a relationship, cannot even decide where to live. Every option feels equally impossible. He is, as they say, stuck. We talk, we explore, and slowly a memory surfaces. He is 7 years old. His parents are divorcing. Bitter, ugly, violent. And both parents desperate, wounded, childish themselves, they turn to him. Who do you love more? They ask. Who do you want to live with? A child, 7 years old, being forced to choose between his two primary sources of survival and love. He couldn't answer, so he learned to never choose. Because choosing meant betrayal. Choosing meant loss. Choosing meant guilt. And now, 30 years later, he sits in my office, unable to choose a restaurant for dinner. Asterisk. This times is what I mean by the past living in the present. The child within him still believes that making a choice will destroy someone he loves, so the adult refuses to choose anything at all. And he calls it keeping his options open. He calls it not wanting to rush. He constructs elaborate philosophical justifications about the nature of commitment and freedom, but underneath, terror. The terror of a 7-year-old boy being asked to destroy his family. Now, you might ask, but Freud, if this is all unconscious, if we don't know we're doing it, how do we escape? Asterisk. This times is the question that consumed my entire career. The answer begins with a simple but profound act. Asterisk. We must make the unconscious conscious. Asterisk. We must bring into the light what has been hidden in darkness. We must name the unnamed patterns. We must see the invisible chains. This is not comfortable work. In fact, it is often excruciating, because to see these patterns means confronting truths we have spent our entire lives avoiding. It means Maria must face the fact that her kindness is actually fear, that her loyalty is actually self-abandonment, that she has sacrificed her life not out of love, but out of an ancient terror of being abandoned herself. It means Thomas must acknowledge that his open-mindedness is actually paralysis, that his philosophical depth is actually avoidance, that he has built an entire identity around the wound of that impossible childhood question. These realizations, they shatter us. They break open the carefully constructed stories we tell ourselves about who we are. And this is why most people never do this work. They sense, somewhere deep down, that looking too closely will destroy the life they've built. So they avoid, they distract, they stay busy. They numb themselves with work, with alcohol, with endless entertainment, with whatever keeps them from sitting alone with their own thoughts. But here is what I learned. After decades of sitting with human suffering, asterisk, the pattern will repeat until it is seen. Asterisk, The woman who cannot stop choosing men who abandon her. She is not unlucky. She is repeating her father's departure, trying again and again to make him stay. Each new relationship is the same scene, the same actors wearing different faces. She tells herself times this one is different asterisk, but her unconscious knows better. It selects precisely the man who will leave, because that is the wound that must be reopened until she finally looks at it. The man who sabotages every success, who drinks himself into oblivion the moment his business begins to thrive. He is not weak. He is obeying a command given to him long ago. Asterisk. You must not surpass your father. You must not have what he could not have. Asterisk. Success feels like betrayal. So he destroys it, reliably, predictably, and calls it bad luck. I spent 50 years watching this mechanism operate. The compulsion to repeat is not a choice, it is a command from the depths. The psyche returns to the scene of the crime again and again, hoping this time to master what once overwhelmed it. But without consciousness, without seeing the pattern clearly, we simply reenact it. We marry our mother. We recreate our childhood powerlessness. We choose friends who betray us exactly as we were betrayed before. This is why insight alone is not enough. A patient can understand intellectually why they behave as they do, can recite the interpretation beautifully, and still times they return home and repeat the same destruction. Knowledge of the pattern is merely the beginning. The pattern must be felt, experienced in the transference, lived through consciously rather than unconsciously enacted. And here is the cruelty of it. The very defense that once protected you now imprisons you. The child who learned to disappear, to make herself small and silent to survive her father's rage, she carries this strategy into adulthood. In the boardroom, she cannot speak her ideas. In her marriage, she cannot voice her needs. The defense that saved her has become her cage. She is still hiding from a man who died 20 years ago. The boy who learned to trust no one, who survived by depending only on himself. He becomes the man who cannot accept help, cannot receive love, cannot allow anyone close enough to hurt him. He is safe. He is also utterly alone. The wall that protected him has become his tomb. You see, the psyche is conservative. It holds on to what worked once, even when circumstances have completely changed. Even when the strategy now creates precisely the suffering it once prevented. This is what makes therapeutic work so delicate, so difficult. You cannot simply tell someone to stop their defense. The defense exists for a reason. It answered a real threat. To remove it prematurely is to leave them naked before the original terror. The defense must be honored first. Asterisk. Thank you for protecting me when I had no other options. Thank you for keeping me alive when I was small and powerless. Asterisk. Only then, slowly, can we examine whether it still serves. Only then can we ask, what would happen if you spoke? What would happen if you trusted? What would happen if you allowed yourself to succeed? The answer is often surprising. Nothing catastrophic happens. The feared punishment does not arrive. The parent who would have raged is no longer there. But the psyche does not know this until it is tested, carefully, in relationship, with someone who will not retaliate or abandon. And so begins the long, often painful work of revision. You test the waters. You reveal something small, a frustration, a boundary, a need, and you wait. The old machinery inside you hums with asterisk. Here it comes. Asterisk. Whispers the ancient circuitry. Asterisk. Here comes the withdrawal, the cold silence, the rage. Asterisk. But it does not come. The other person listens. They do not crumble. They do not attack. they remain present. And something in you, something held rigid for decades, begins, ever so slightly, to soften. This is corrective emotional experience. Not insight alone, not understanding, but the visceral, embodied realization that the old rules no longer apply. That you can speak and not be annihilated. That you can need and not be shamed. That you can falter and not be abandoned. The neurotic solution was brilliant, you see, but it was designed for a world that no longer exists. You built a fortress to protect against threats that have long since vanished. And now you live inside that fortress, mistaking its walls for the boundaries of reality itself. The therapist, or the loving partner, or the steadfast friend stands outside those walls and says, gently, persistently, asterisk, there is more space here than you think. Asterisk, but you cannot simply believe this. You must experience it, again and again. You must bump against the limits you imagined and find them absent. You must reach for connection expecting pain and receive, instead, presence. This is why insight alone rarely heals, because the wound was not created by faulty thinking. It was created by experience, by the overwhelming moments when your psyche could not yet make sense of what was happening. When love and pain became confused, when your need for attachment collided with the unbearable reality of neglect or intrusion. To heal, you need new experiences, not lectures, not platitudes, but actual moments where the old pattern is activated, where you feel the terror rise, where the defenses mobilize, and then, miraculously, the catastrophe does not occur. You expect rejection and receive curiosity. You brace for criticism and encounter compassion. You prepare for abandonment and find constancy. Each time this happens, the psyche takes note. Not consciously, perhaps. Not in words, but deep in the limbic system, where the old maps are stored, a new notation appears. Asterisk. Perhaps it is safe to be seen. Perhaps I can survive being known. Asterisk. Of course, the psyche is cautious. It will not abandon its defenses easily. After all, these mechanisms once saved you. To discard them feels like standing naked before a firing squad. And so you will test the relationship repeatedly. You will push, withdraw, provoke anything to confirm that yes, the old danger still lurks. Yes, you were right to protect yourself so thoroughly. This is what we call resistance. But I tell you, resistance is not the enemy. It is the voice of the frightened child within, checking to see if it is truly safe to come out of hiding. The wise therapist, the attuned partner, does not berate this resistance. They welcome it. They understand. Asterisk. You are showing me how you were hurt. You are demonstrating the exact shape of the original wound. Asterisk. And in that recognition, in that patient, non-retaliatory presence, the possibility emerges that you might lower the drawbridge just an inch, that you might let someone see the tender, undefended parts of you that you have protected for so very long. This is terrifying, more terrifying, often, than remaining in your neurosis, because remaining in your neurosis is familiar, it is known territory. Yes, it is painful, but it is times your times pain, the devil you know. To change is to venture into uncertainty, to risk disappointment, to acknowledge that you have spent years, perhaps decades, organizing your entire life around a threat that may no longer exist. The ego resists this mightily. It says, asterisk. But what if I am wrong? What if I open myself and am destroyed? Asterisk. And this asterisk is the fundamental neurosis of our age. The ego does not recognize that it is times already, times destroyed by its rigidity. It is already broken by its refusal to bend. The fortress mentality, the endless defensiveness, times this times is what exhausts you. This is what makes you old before your time. I see this pattern repeatedly in those who come to my couch. A young man cannot accept criticism about his work, and so he loses opportunity after opportunity. A woman cannot admit she was wrong in an argument with her husband, and so 30 years of marriage crumble over accumulations of small stubbornnesses. An artist receives feedback and becomes so wounded, so defended, that they stop creating altogether. The irony, the tragic irony. They protect themselves into extinction. But observe the truly strong individuals, the ones who have done the inner work of analysis, who have made peace with their own unconscious. When they are confronted with their errors, something extraordinary happens. There is a pause, a breath, and then, asterisk. You may be right. Let me consider this. Asterisk. This is not weakness. This is strength. This is the integrated personality that no longer needs to be times right, times in order to feel, times safe, asterisk. Because here is what your ego will not tell you. Being right all the time is a prison of your own construction. Every time you defend a position you know is questionable, every time you twist reality to preserve your self-image, you make the prison walls a little thicker. You separate yourself further from truth, from connection, from the possibility of genuine growth. And for what? For what do you sacrifice all this? For the temporary comfort of not feeling vulnerable, for the illusion that you are in control, for the fantasy that if you never admit error, you will never have to confront your fundamental human limitation. Let me share with you something I learned late in my own life, and at great cost. In my early work, I developed theories about female sexuality that were, I can now acknowledge, limited by the prejudices of my time and circumstance. For years, I defended these positions. I had invested in them. My reputation was built upon them. To question them felt like questioning my entire life's work. But evidence mounted. Colleagues challenged me. Patients told me their experiences did not match my theories, and I had a choice: protect my ego or pursue truth. I did not make this choice gracefully, I confess. I resisted, I rationalized, I argued, but eventually times, I had to sit with the discomfort and ask myself, asterisk, am I more committed to being right or to understanding what is real? Asterisk. This question, my friend, this is the question that separates the child from the adult, the neurotic from the analyzed, the rigid from the fluid. And when you choose reality over righteousness, something miraculous occurs. You do not collapse, you do not dissolve. Instead, you times expand asterisk. Your capacity for understanding grows. Your relationships deepen because people can actually reach you now. You become, paradoxically, more solid by becoming more flexible. Think of the willow tree in the storm. The oak, rigid and proud, snaps, but the willow bends, yields to the wind, and survives. Your ego wants you to be the oak. It tells you that to bend is to break. But nature knows better than your ego. The resistance to being wrong is ultimately a resistance to time's change asterisk. And the resistance to change is a resistance to time's life itself asterisk. Because life is change. Life is flux. Life is the constant dissolution and reformation of everything you think you know. When you cling desperately to being right, you are clinging to a moment that has already passed. You are trying to make permanent what is inherently temporary. You are fighting against the fundamental nature of existence. And times this futile battle, this is what creates your suffering. So what is the alternative? What does it mean to live without this desperate need to be right? It means you approach each day with what I call productive uncertainty. You hold your beliefs firmly enough to act upon them, but loosely enough to revise them when evidence demands it. You commit fully to your current understanding while remaining open to its evolution. This is not weakness, it is the highest form of intellectual courage. The weak mind clings to certainty because it fears the abyss of not knowing. The strong mind walks to the edge of that abyss and looks down, unafraid. I have seen this courage in my own practice countless times. A patient arrives, convinced they understand the source of their suffering. My father was distant, they tell me. That is why I cannot love. And perhaps there is truth in this. But if I allow them to stop there, if I permit them to cement this explanation into absolute truth, I have failed them. Because the human psyche is not a simple machine with one broken part. It is a vast, interconnected system where every element affects every other. So I ask questions. I probe gently at the edges of their certainty. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes a crack appears. Through that crack, light enters. A new possibility emerges. Perhaps the distant father was not the cause, but the symptom of something deeper. Perhaps what they call inability to love is actually a sophisticated defense against a different fear entirely. The patient who can tolerate this uncertainty, who can hold multiple possibilities simultaneously without demanding immediate resolution, is the patient who heals. The one who must know, who must be certain, who must have the answer, now and forever. This patient remains trapped in their original narrative, no matter how much it fails to serve them. Consider the act of listening itself, true listening, not the performance of waiting for your turn to speak. When you genuinely listen to another person, you must temporarily surrender your certainty about them. You must allow their reality to exist alongside yours without immediately judging which is correct. This is extraordinarily difficult. Your ego screams for you to categorize, to interpret, to fit their experience into your existing framework. But if you can resist this urge, if you can sit with the discomfort of not immediately knowing, something remarkable happens. You begin to understand them not as a character in your story, but as a complete person with their own valid perspective. You might still disagree. You might ultimately conclude they are mistaken. But you will disagree with what they actually believe, not with your caricature of it. This is what the world desperately needs now, not more people certain of their righteousness, but more people capable of this kind of listening. Wars are not fought over actual differences. They are fought over misunderstandings calcified into absolute truth. Nations do not destroy each other because they truly comprehend one another's positions and simply disagree. They destroy each other because each side has constructed a fantasy of the other's motives and convinced themselves this fantasy is reality. In your personal life, every relationship you value depends on this skill. Your partner frustrates you. The ego immediately offers an explanation. They are selfish, or they do not care, or they are trying to hurt you. How certain are you of this interpretation? Have you considered even one alternative explanation with genuine openness? Perhaps they are struggling with something you cannot see. Perhaps their behavior, which looks like disregard to you, is actually their clumsy attempt to protect something precious. I am not suggesting you accept mistreatment or deny obvious patterns. I am suggesting that between this person is perfect and I understand their every motive, with complete certainty, lies a vast middle ground where most truth resides. The person who can inhabit this middle ground, who can say, I am hurt by this behavior and I do not claim to fully understand why they are doing it, possesses a maturity most never achieve. This middle ground is uncomfortable. It requires you to hold two truths simultaneously, your legitimate pain and your inevitable ignorance. The mind rebels against this. It wants either Or either I'm wrong to feel hurt, or they're deliberately cruel. Either I trust completely, or I protect myself completely. But relationships, real relationships, exist in the tension between these absolutes. I have watched patients waste years of their lives imprisoned by narratives they constructed in moments of pain. A woman whose mother forgot her birthday decided it meant 30 years of hidden resentment finally surfacing. She built an entire story about maternal rejection, about never being truly loved, about a lifetime of pretense finally crumbling. When they finally spoke about it, truly spoke, not just exchanged accusations, she discovered her mother had been consumed with worry about a serious medical diagnosis she hadn't yet shared. The forgotten birthday wasn't a symbol of anything except human overwhelm. The tragedy is not that she misunderstood. The tragedy is that her certainty nearly prevented the conversation that would have revealed the truth. Her story felt so complete, so internally consistent, that reality seemed almost inconvenient by comparison. You see, once you've constructed a comprehensive explanation for someone's behavior, you develop an investment in that explanation. It has cost you something to build it: emotional energy, mental effort, the pain of believing you understand why you've been hurt. To abandon it feels like waste. So instead, you defend it. You look for confirming evidence and ignore disconfirming evidence. You interpret ambiguous behaviors in ways that support your narrative. You become, without realizing it, more committed to your story than to the truth. This is why the most dangerous moment in any relationship conflict is not the moment of hurt, but the moment just after, when you begin explaining to yourself what the hurt means. This is when you are most likely to mistake your fear for insight, your assumptions for facts, your partial perspective for complete understanding. The alternative requires something far more difficult than constructing theories about others. It requires living with uncertainty. It requires approaching someone and saying, essentially, this happened and I felt this, and I don't know why you did it. This vulnerability feels dangerous because it is dangerous. You're offering your pain without the protective armor of righteous understanding. You're admitting you don't have all the answers. But here is what I have observed. The relationships that survive are not those where hurt never happens. They are those where people can present their hurt without claiming omniscience about its causes. I felt dismissed when you looked at your phone during our conversation is entirely different from, you always prioritize everyone else over me because you've never truly valued our relationship. The first creates space for dialogue. The second demands only confession or conflict. The person who hurt you may have been thoughtless, yes. Selfish, perhaps. Acting from their own unprocessed pain, almost certainly. But the moment you believe you fully understand their interior world, you have stopped seeing them as another consciousness and begun seeing them as a character in your own psychological drama. And characters, unlike people, cannot surprise you with explanations you never considered. I have learned, through decades of listening, truly listening, to reconsider my certainty 100 times before declaring understanding. The patient who seems resistant may simply be responding to a question I have not yet learned to ask. The colleague who appears vindictive may be protecting something I cannot see from where I stand. This does not mean we excuse cruelty. It does not mean we accept mistreatment or rationalize away genuine harm. You can hold someone accountable for their actions while simultaneously acknowledging the profound mystery of what drives them. These are not contradictory positions. They are, in fact, the only honest positions available to us. The alternative, the smug certainty that we have mapped every corridor of their motivation, is a kind of violence itself. It reduces them. It flattens the infinite complexity of a human being into a convenient explanation that serves our own narrative needs. And here is the uncomfortable part. We do this most aggressively with people we are actively in conflict with. When someone has hurt us, wounded us, betrayed us precisely when understanding matters most. We rush to judgment with the greatest speed and confidence. The pain itself becomes evidence. We say, "They hurt me, therefore I understand exactly why they did it," as if suffering grants omniscience. It does not. Suffering grants suffering. Understanding requires something else entirely. A willingness to hold multiple possibilities simultaneously, to resist the seductive comfort of a single satisfying explanation. I think often of a woman I treated many years ago. She came to me with what appeared to be straightforward hysteria, sudden paralysis in her right arm with no organic cause. In our early sessions, she spoke bitterly about her sister, who had married well while she remained single and working in their father's shop. The resentment was palpable. Every story she told about her sister dripped with barely concealed envy. A simpler analyst might have stopped there. The case seemed clear, unconscious jealousy manifesting as physical symptom, but something in her tone made me continue listening, continue asking. And slowly, over months, a different picture emerged. The sister she resented was also the sister she had protected as a child from their father's rage. The marriage she envied was also the abandonment she mourned. The arm that would not move was the arm that had once held her sister through nightmares, and now held nothing. Her anger was real, her envy was real, but underneath both, sustaining both, was a grief so vast she could not speak it directly. She could not say, "I miss my sister," because saying it would mean admitting how much she still loved her, how much the distance between them cost her daily. Anger was safer. Resentment could be held without vulnerability. If I had stopped at my first understanding, I would have treated the wrong wound. I would have addressed the symptom while ignoring the source, and she would have remained exactly as she was paralyzed, bitter, alone. The same applies to the people who populate our daily resentments, the boss who seems to delight in your failure, the parent who cannot acknowledge your accomplishments, the friend who always, somehow, makes themselves the center of every conversation. Yes, their behavior impacts you. Yes, you have every right to protect yourself from it. But the moment you believe you have completely understood why they do what they do, you have stopped looking at a person and started looking at a projection. That projection becomes its own kind of tyranny. You carry them in your mind, rehearsing conversations that will never happen, predicting reactions to scenarios that haven't occurred. You become so convinced of your understanding that you stop seeing what's actually in front of you. The narcissist in your imagination is far more coherent, far more strategic than any real person could ever be. Real people are messy. They contradict themselves. They act out of exhaustion, confusion, mimicry of what they saw growing up. But the projection is always perfectly consistent, always fully intentional, always entirely aware. And here's where it becomes truly costly. That projection starts to control you. You make decisions based not on what has actually happened, but on what you're certain they're thinking. You avoid conversations because you're convinced you know how they'll respond. You withdraw because you've already written the script of their judgment in your mind. You protect yourself from attacks that never come, while the real wounds, the ones you didn't predict, slip through unnoticed. I spent decades listening to people describe their parents, their lovers, their rivals, and so often, by the third or fourth session, I could already see the gap widening between the person they were describing and the myth they had constructed. The mother who was cold became the mother who never loved them. The partner who was selfish became the partner incapable of love. And yes, sometimes those conclusions were accurate, but more often, they were simplifications that protected the patient from a more painful truth, that they were loved, just badly, that the other person tried, just inadequately, that there was care mixed with the cruelty, and that mixture is so much harder to metabolize than pure villainy. When you recognize narcissistic patterns in someone, you're holding valuable information. Use it to set boundaries. Use it to adjust your expectations. Use it to protect your energy and your heart. But don't mistake that recognition for complete knowledge. Don't assume that because you can name the pattern, you know the whole person. Every label we apply is both a revelation and a blindfold. It shows us something true while hiding something else equally true. The most dangerous thing about understanding psychology isn't that you'll get it wrong. It's that you'll get it partly right and believe you've gotten it completely right. You'll take your 10% of insight and stretch it across the whole person, the whole relationship, the whole history. And in doing that, you lose your ability to be surprised. You lose your ability to notice change. You lose your capacity to see when someone is struggling to be different because you've already decided who they are. This doesn't mean you trust blindly. It means you observe precisely. Watch what people do, not what you've decided they are. Notice patterns, yes, but also notice deviations from those patterns. The narcissist who admits fault, even once. The avoidant person who reaches out, even awkwardly. These moments matter. They're data points that complicate your theory, and complication is where truth lives. The child's unconscious doesn't understand nuance, it only understands patterns and absolutes. When someone important leaves, hurts us, or fails to meet our needs, the child concludes, "This is what people do. This is what love means. This is what I can expect." And here's what makes this so devastatingly effective as a defense mechanism. We don't consciously remember making this decision. We simply wake up one day as adults and discover we've been living according to rules we never agreed to follow. You find yourself sabotaging relationships right when they get serious, and you don't know why. You're drawn to people who can't fully commit, and you tell yourself it's coincidence. You keep your emotional distance and call it independence, never recognizing it as the fortress your younger self built to survive. I've seen patients who could articulate, with impressive intellectual clarity, exactly how their childhood shaped their attachment patterns. They could diagram their defenses, name their triggers, explain their behavioral cycles with clinical precision, and yet they couldn't change them. Because knowing about the wound is not the same as healing it. Understanding your defense mechanisms intellectually is not the same as dismantling them emotionally. The unconscious doesn't respond to logical arguments, it responds to experience, to new patterns that slowly, gradually prove the old ones obsolete. This is why transformation takes time. Why therapy isn't a switch you flip, but a relationship you build. Why reading self-help books feels enlightening but rarely produces lasting change. The child inside you isn't impressed by your adult insights. That child needs something else entirely. What does that child need? Safety, consistency, evidence that contradicts the old story. Not promises evidence, not explanations experience, not one grand gesture that proves love is real, but 1,000 small moments that accumulate into a new pattern your nervous system can finally trust. This is the work of secure attachment that I couldn't fully articulate in my time, but that research has now illuminated. You don't think your way into secure attachment, you experience your way into it, through relationships that show up consistently. Through connections that don't abandon you when you're difficult. Through people who stay even when your defenses push them away. And sometimes, perhaps most powerfully, through becoming that person for yourself. I watch people discover this with a kind of quiet amazement. The anxious person who learns to self-soothe instead of frantically calling their partner. The avoidant person who practices sitting with uncomfortable feelings instead of intellectualizing them away. The disorganized person who slowly builds routines and structures that their childhood chaos never provided. These aren't dramatic transformations, they're subtle recalibrations, small rebellions against old programming. And they are some of the bravest work a human can do because they require you to act against every instinct the child in you developed to survive. Your unconscious will resist. It will scream that you're being reckless, naive, foolish. It will manufacture crises to pull you back into familiar patterns. It will whisper that people who trust get hurt, that vulnerability is weakness, that the only safe love is the one you can control or the one you never fully commit to. This is the voice of the child who was hurt. Listen to it with compassion, but don't let it drive. Because here's what that frightened child doesn't know. You're not 7 years old anymore. The parent who left, the caregiver who was inconsistent, the early relationship that taught you love was dangerous. These people no longer have power over your present unless you give it to them. And you give it to them every time you let those early patterns determine your current choices. The question becomes, how do we stop giving them that power? It starts with something I call emotional archaeology. You must dig through the layers of your current reactions to find the original wound. When you feel that spike of panic as your partner doesn't text back, pause. Don't act on the feeling. Examine it. Ask yourself, how old do I feel right now? What memory is this echoing? Most people discover they feel very young in these moments, because that's what's happening. Your 7-year-old self has hijacked your 40-year-old brain. I had a patient who would become enraged whenever her husband made plans without consulting her. Enraged. She would accuse him of not caring, of excluding her, of treating her like she didn't matter. But when we examined this reaction, we found something fascinating. She was 9 years old again, sitting at the dinner table while her parents discussed sending her to boarding school, as if she weren't there. The current situation, her husband making plans, wasn't the real problem. She was responding to a decades-old wound about invisibility and powerlessness. Once she understood this, everything changed. Not overnight, of course, but she could catch herself in those moments and ask, is this really about the dinner reservation he made, or is this about something older? Is my response proportional to what's actually happening, or am I responding to a ghost? This is the work. This is how we break the cycle, not by pretending the past doesn't matter, but by refusing to let it write our present-day script. You need to create what I call a reality buffer, a space between the trigger and your response where you can assess what's actually happening versus what your history is telling you is happening. Your anxious attachment wants you to believe that silence means abandonment, but in reality, silence might just mean someone is in a meeting. Your avoidant patterns want you to believe that vulnerability means annihilation, but in reality, sharing your feelings might just mean connection. The buffer is where you choose. Without it, you're simply a puppet dancing to strings pulled by people who aren't even in the room anymore. And here's something crucial. Breaking these patterns doesn't mean you won't feel the feelings. That anxious surge when your partner is distant, you'll still feel it. The impulse to withdraw when things get too intimate, still there. But you don't have to obey these feelings. You don't have to let them dictate your behavior. Think of it like this. You're standing on a train platform, and your anxious thoughts are trains rushing by. He doesn't care. She's going to leave. I'm not enough. This will end badly. These thoughts will come, but you don't have to board every train. You can watch them pass, acknowledge they're there, and choose to stay on the platform. This is radical, because we've been taught that our feelings are always valid, always true, always worth acting on. But sometimes our feelings are liars. Sometimes they're outdated security systems, alarms going off for threats that no longer exist. Your emotional system learned to protect you when you were powerless, but you're not powerless now. You have choices your child self never had. The most powerful thing you can do is develop what I call dual consciousness. Part of you feels the panic, the fear, the desperate need to control or withdraw. But another part of you, the adult, aware part, observes this and says, I see you. I know you're trying to protect me, but we're safe now. We can choose differently. When this happens, when we speak to our inner protector with such compassion, something remarkable occurs. The rigidity begins to soften, not all at once, not dramatically, but like ice in springtime, gradually yielding to warmth. I remember a patient, a talented musician, who had not touched his violin in 7 years. 7 years! The instrument sat in its case beneath his bed, gathering dust, a relic of what he called his foolish youth. He had been humiliated once a single review that mocked his interpretation of Brahms, and his psyche had concluded, better silence than shame. Better to lock away the part of him that feels deeply than to risk such exposure again. For months, we explored this paralysis. He spoke of it intellectually, abstractly, as though we were discussing someone else's neurosis entirely. But one afternoon, I remember it was raining, the sound drumming against my office windows. He said something that changed everything. Sometimes I hear music in my head, and my hands move without my permission, as though they remember what my mind has forbidden. His body remembered what his conscious self had tried to bury. This is the wisdom beneath our defenses. They cannot completely extinguish what is essential to us. They can only contain it, compress it, push it down into the darkness where we hope it will quietly expire. But it never does. It pulses there, waiting, like a seed beneath winter soil. I asked him to bring the violin to our next session. Just bring it, nothing more. When he arrived, case in hand, his face was pale, his hands trembling slightly. The case sat between us like a third presence in the room, neither of us mentioning it directly for the first half hour. Then I said, simply, "What would happen if you opened it?" "I don't know," he whispered. "What do you fear would happen?" He was silent for a long time. Then, "That I would remember. That I would feel everything I've worked so hard not to feel. That I would want it again, want to play, want to create, and then I would fail, and the disappointment would destroy me." Do you hear the architecture of his defense? If I don't open this case, I cannot be disappointed. If I don't try, I cannot fail. If I don't allow myself to want, I cannot experience loss. It is the logic of survival, and it is, in its own way, impeccable. But survival is not the same as living. I leaned forward. Your mind believes that wanting is dangerous. That desire leads inevitably to humiliation. But may I suggest something? What if the real danger is not in the wanting, but in the exile of everything that gives your life meaning? He opened the case that day. Did not play, simply opened it, looked at the instrument, touched the strings with his fingertips, and wept. Wept for all the years of silence, for the part of himself he had abandoned, for the prison he had constructed from his own fear. This is what happens when we stop fighting the defense and start understanding it. We create space for what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's inherent capacity to hold opposites, to allow seemingly contradictory truths to coexist. Yes, you might fail. Yes, you might experience disappointment. And yes, you might also experience joy, connection, transcendence, the peculiar ecstasy of doing what you were made to do. Your defenses whisper, choose safety, choose control, choose the known suffering over the unknown risk. But there is another voice, quieter perhaps, but no less insistent. It says, choose wholeness, choose truth, choose the risk of being fully alive over the certainty of being partially dead. And wholeness is not what they promised you. It's not Instagram-filtered tranquility. It's not the absence of conflict. Wholeness is integration. It's standing in your living room at 3 in the morning, holding both your rage and your tenderness, your ambition and your exhaustion, your love and your resentment, and saying, asterisk, all of this is mine, all of this is me. Asterisk. The ego's final task isn't to defeat the shadow or transcend the id. It's to become large enough to contain the full spectrum of what you are. And here's what no one tells you. That capacity, that largeness, doesn't come from addition. It comes from subtraction. You don't need more affirmations, more courses, more podcasts telling you how to optimize your morning routine. You need times less asterisk, less pretense, less performance, less of the exhausting theater of being who you think you should be. Strip it away. The LinkedIn personality, the dinner party persona, the carefully curated version you present to your parents, your partner, your children. What's left when you remove the costume? Asterisk. That's times the raw material of transformation. I spent decades in a consulting room listening to people describe their lives as if they were reading from a script someone else had written. I should want this. I should feel that. I should be grateful, successful, satisfied. And underneath every should was a scream. Asterisk. But I don't. I'm not. Please help me understand why I can't just be what everyone needs me to be. Asterisk. And my answer, then and now. Because you're not a character in someone else's narrative. You're a human being with an unconscious that refuses to be edited, a body that remembers what your mind tries to forget, and a soul, yes, I'll use that word, that knows when you're lying to it. The depression, the anxiety, the insomnia, the unnamed dread that wakes you at 4 a.m. These aren't malfunctions. They're times, messages, asterisk. Your psyche is speaking to you in the only language it has left, because you've stopped listening to the quieter ones. What if you listened? What if, instead of medicating the message, or meditating it away, you sat with it? What if you asked, asterisk, what are you trying to tell me? What part of my life have I made so small that it has to scream to be heard? Asterisk. This is the work, not the work of healing, but the work of times becoming asterisk. And becoming is a lifelong negotiation between who you were, who you are, and who you might still be. There's a concept I want to leave you with, something I observed again and again in my practice. The return of the repressed. What you exile doesn't disappear. It gathers strength in the darkness. It waits. And then, when you're least prepared, it comes back in a panic attack, a failed marriage, a career that suddenly feels like a prison, a body that finally refuses to go on pretending. The repressed times returns. The only question is whether it returns as a symptom or as a revelation. If you keep running, it will hunt you down as illness, as crisis, as collapse. But if you turn and face it, if you invite it in, sit it down, and ask what it needs, it can become the catalyst for everything you've been too afraid to choose. That rage you've swallowed for 20 years? It might be the boundary you've needed to set. That grief you've postponed? It might be the door to a tenderness you forgot you had. That desire you've labeled inappropriate. It might be the map back to your own aliveness. This is not permission to act on every impulse. This is an invitation to times no, times every truth, to make conscious what has been unconscious, to bring light to the basement of your psyche, not to sanitize it, but to understand it. Because in understanding, you find choice. And in choice, you find freedom. And what is freedom, really? It is not the absence of desire, as some philosophers would have you believe. It is not the transcendence of the flesh, or the elevation to some pure rational state. No. Freedom is the capacity to recognize that you are divided, that you house contradictions, that you are both the civilized creature who says please and thank you, and the animal who wants to take without asking. The modern world sells you a different story. It tells you that you can be whole, complete, unified. Buy this product, follow this routine, adopt this mindset, and all your internal conflicts will dissolve like sugar in water. It is a beautiful lie, and you want to believe it, because the alternative that you will always be at war with yourself to some degree is exhausting to contemplate. But here is what they don't tell you. The war is where the art is made. The tension between what you want and what you allow yourself to want, between who you are and who you pretend to be, this is the friction that generates every meaningful thing you will ever create. Your neurosis is not a bug in your programming. It is a feature. It is the pressure that turns carbon into diamond. I did not develop psychoanalysis to cure people of being human. I developed it to help people be more times human, more fully themselves, with all the messiness and contradiction that entails. The goal was never to eliminate the unconscious, but to bring it into conversation with consciousness, to get the two sides of yourself speaking to each other instead of screaming past each other in the dark. Think of it this way. You have spent your entire life trying to be consistent, coherent, unified. You have built a self-image and you defend it fiercely. I am a good person, I am rational, I am in control. And then your dreams betray you. Your slips of the tongue betray you. Your sudden, inexplicable irritations betray you. And instead of seeing these as messages from another part of yourself, you treat them as glitches to be suppressed. But what if they are not glitches? What if they are letters from the basement, and the basement has been trying to reach you for years? What if the anxiety that wakes you at 3 in the morning is actually trying to tell you something important about how you are living your life? What if the anger that seems to come from nowhere is actually coming from exactly where you refuse to look? This is the work. Not to silence these voices, but to translate them, to learn the language of your own depths. And it is hard work, make no mistake. It requires you to sit with discomfort, to face truths you have spent decades hiding from yourself. It requires you to admit that you do not know yourself as well as you thought you did. But the alternative is to remain a stranger to yourself, forever puzzled by your own behavior, forever asking, why did I do that? Why do I feel this way? While the answers sit just beneath the surface, waiting for you to dive. So dive. Not recklessly, but with intention. With curiosity instead of judgment. With the understanding that what you find down there is not your enemy, it is you, the fullness of you. The complicated, contradictory, magnificent disaster of you. And in that recognition, in that integration, you find something far more valuable than happiness. You find authenticity. You find power. You find the capacity to live as a whole person instead of a curated image. And that, my friend, is the only freedom worth having.